Hello everyone, with great pleasure I welcome all of you on the Free Russia Forum channel. My name is Dmitry Semyonov and today we have Yuri Felshtinsky with us, a historian. Hello everyone, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for coming, and we always have things to talk about. We have quite a disruptive beginning of 2026, like on all the fronts. In fact, Donald Trump is very active in the Western Hemisphere, as he called it. Nicolas Maduro was captured, and now he is on trial in the US. And two Russian tankers yesterday were captured, one near Venezuela and another one in Caribbean Sea. And today, Lindsey Graham announced that Donald Trump gave green light to toughen the sanctions against Russia, and next week Congress is going to consider this matter. Can we say that all these events prove that there is a certain turnaround in Donald Trump's policy toward Russia, or maybe there are more global processes? It is clear that everybody is anticipating that there will be turnaround in the policy. Everybody wants it. I'd say we should be more cautious with all these hopes, because unfortunately Trump is a case of the broken clock that shows correct time twice in 24 hours. In Trump's case, this is Israel and Venezuela. You see, Trump manages to darken positive moments in the American history with new plans that don't quite fit into the American history, at least into that American history that later will be described as a positive one. Because, sadly, for Trump, if we take Maduro, for example, it's an attempt to demonstrate to the world that overthrowing governments in other countries is okay. There is a lot to talk about, and we agree that there are many regimes that I would be happy if they're overthrown. For example, in Europe, such country as Belarus. But Trump is not planning to overthrow Lukashenko's regime and change anything in Belarus. He is planning to annex Greenland, which is a part of Kingdom of Denmark, which is also part of NATO. Hitler and Stalin, at a certain point, they signed a treaty to divide Europe. They were people of so-called old school. They were bureaucratic in many ways. That's why those treaties were put on paper. And historians at some point, they got access to those treaties. And we could read what countries were under the influence of the Soviet Union and what countries were under the influence of the Nazi Germany. Some of those countries were occupied and Europe was divided. I wouldn't rule out a possibility that, sadly for all of us, Trump and Putin, they also made certain agreements. But these agreements, unlike the agreements of 1939 between Hitler and Stalin, these agreements are verbal, not written, and they did it to avoid evidence. So I think that the basis of those agreements is that Russia will get Ukraine and the United States would get Venezuela and Greenland. And Putin is not concerned about Greenland in this regard. I think he's smiling at Trump's plans to annex Greenland, yet understanding that if it's going to be an open conflict between the United States and Europe, this will be the exact result that Putin needs, clearly why, and sadly, Trump will need it too, because Europe is also a stronghold of democracy that Trump is sort of fighting against, this kind of global democracy. So we together welcome kidnapping Maduro. At the same time, let's admit that Trump is in no rush to recognize the results of the elections that were held in Venezuela. Maduro stole those results. Yet, in Venezuela, they have a legally elected democratic president. Trump also is trying to make agreements not with a democratic leader and also a Nobel Prize winner. He is dealing with the supporters of Maduro's regime. In some way, he thinks that it will be easier to make agreements with them. And also, instead of Maduro, he's trying to put himself in that position, in the position of a leader of the country, who will be dealing with the mineral resources of Venezuela. Venezuela is very rich with different mineral resources. And I can see how Kushner and Witkoff will fly to Venezuela to make orders regarding those resources. So, even when he does something good, he wraps it in such a way that it makes us appalled. So let's see what's going to happen in Greenland. Rubio is flying there to pressure the Danes. Unfortunately, it makes the gap even wider between the United States and Europe, and we know that the conflict between the United States and Europe means that the United States will give up Ukraine, which is actually done. The US already gave up on Ukraine, but Europe is still resisting to do that. And here, I don't see any change. I don't think there will be any deal between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. I have several follow-up questions for you. When you say, yes, sometimes even a broken clock shows correct time at least twice in 24 hours. On the one hand, we have Maduro in Venezuela, and we welcome this, of course. Maduro is on trial, and we hope that for all his crimes he will be convicted. But on the other hand, Trump is threatening Greenland. But together with Venezuela, we can put also Cuba, Colombia, Iran, and Nicaragua. So all this is positive things, and just Greenland. Well, nevertheless, the positive result we have is only in Venezuela. And obviously, there's a lot of work for Trump. And even with Venezuela, it's not quite clear, because if Trump really supported democratic forces of Venezuela, and in this sense assisted them with the coup and the change of the regime, then things could fall into place pretty quickly. But what the situation for Venezuela will be right now, we don't quite understand. because since for Trump the main matter is to organize access for the American oil corporation to the Venezuelan market, and he's trying to take over this Venezuelan market. And the market is in pretty bad shape because the country's economy is in bad shape. So if he does that, it's not necessarily change the regime and the political situation in the country. So let's not rush ahead, because with Maduro the situation is changing and certain events are happening in Iran, and the protesters are fighting the regime there. Sadly, Trump doesn't believe in people and doesn't believe in democracy. Trump believes in collusions of political leaders. Those collusions between himself and Putin and Xi Jinping, and he doesn't believe in democracy. That's why the protests in Iran, and actually for this reason, he's not really interested in them. He is looking for a leader that he can make a deal with. I think this is the main problem with Trump. If we put our emotions aside. But if we react emotionally to what's going on, then of course everything he does is absolutely appalling. But again, let's see what the results will be. And of course it's easier to deal with certain things in Venezuela than in other countries. Of course, it is easier than, for example, in Cuba or Iran or Colombia. So we'll see. Sanctions. Trump himself doesn't really believe much, and he spoke about it a lot, and I think he was sincere about that. Trump understands very well that sanctions will not make Russia stop the war. Trump understands it very well. Trump also understands very well that to make Putin stop the war can be done only if American weapons are provided to Ukraine, like it was done many years ago when the Soviet Union lost the war in Afghanistan, after Americans started providing their weapons to Afghanis. Trump understands it very well. That's why sanctions sound very well. And in fact, those sanctions, they don't complicate life for America, and America actually gets benefits. And on the contrary, these sanctions hit not only China and India, as they say, against whom these sanctions were introduced, and it also hits Europe. So therefore, sanctions policy of the United States is pretty weak, and it has been like that always, and European sanctions are pretty weak as well. And since 2014, watching the sanctions policy, it's impossible to make Russia stop the war using sanctions. You can watch ruble exchange rate, and within the low prices of oil, still the ruble exchange rate is pretty stable. So that's why sanctions can't make a dent. Can we say confidently that Trump is not this agent Krasnov, agent of KGB? Well, you know, as I said many times in different situations, I don't remember if we spoke about it on your channel. It is impossible to prove if somebody is an agent. In the modern state, in the modern time, it's impossible to do that. So, and I never did. Just not to waste anybody's time and not to mislead anybody. It is not so important whether Trump was recruited at some point or not. The time has passed. And it's actually the case when, if even he was recruited, he already overgrew all his supervisors. So we're living in a completely different world with Trump. And it's not so important today if he was recruited or if they actually have a file with discrediting materials against him. We can see how Epstein files unfolding, and there is a lot of compromising evidence there, including Trump, because objectively speaking, we need to say that there are lots of discrediting materials against Clinton, also the President of the United States. So, therefore, compromising evidence is already compromised. So, using compromising evidence in order to pressure politicians is not as simple as it was in the past decades. I recalled it actually more sort of like a joke, because Bill Clinton was bombing Belgrade when there was a scandal with Monica Lewinsky in the US. And the fact that Trump is kidnapping Maduro during Epstein file scandal, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. But naturally it distracts the public opinion, distracts it from the story that was all over the place, in all headlines. And again, I emphasize it's not important whether Trump was recruited or not by the Soviet KGB. What's important is that he and Putin have a total compatibility of their strategic goals. For both of them, it's important to destroy Europe, to destroy democracy in Europe, to split Europe into separate states, and to destroy the system of the European Union. And I think in this sense, I suspect it's important to them to cancel NATO. And actually NATO, as it used to be, is not anymore. It exists as a coalition of European countries that used to form NATO. So, and I think these two icebreakers, if you wish, Trump and Putin, Trump, who is making a way for Putin through Ukraine to Europe, and Putin, who is making a way for Trump to Europe through destroying Europe. I think this is a very important strategic point. This could be resisted only by a united Europe, including Ukraine and some other democratic countries that are probably not part of Europe. For example, Japan, Canada, Australia, all these countries, they remain in the bloc of democratic countries that will resist Russian aggression, and they will resist such classical imperialistic goals of Trump, like annexing Canada and taking over Greenland. I think here Trump will face expected resistance from Europe, but since now Europe has a real army that resists Russian aggression, and it goes without saying that this is Ukrainian army, not European army. Europe is safe for now. Therefore, on the one hand, Ukraine is safe despite all the attacks from Russia, because Europe supports Ukraine and assists Ukraine. And it's not only Europe, and I would like to underline this. I just don't want to go through the full list of the countries that support Ukraine. I mean, all democratic countries of the world support Ukraine. But on the other hand, since Ukraine has a 1 million army, Russia can't really invade Europe. So therefore, this stalemate for Putin and for Trump, to some degree, this situation will go on like this throughout 2026. I don't expect any big changes, and I said it many times, unless Ukraine gets long-range missiles. Some missiles Ukraine can produce itself, like Flamingo missiles, and until the tactics of the war changes. And this change means carrying out missile strikes on Moscow. Otherwise, 2026 won't be any different than 2025. Trump will make new attempts to make Ukraine capitulate. Putin will keep drafting new capitulation plans for Trump, including another 20 or 28 points in those plans. And this marking time will go on like this across 2026. If the tactics of the war changes, if Ukraine carries out strikes on Moscow, I expect to see Russia at the negotiation table 2 weeks after the strikes begin. When you say that you expect that Ukraine will get long-range missiles, and you said that they may produce those missiles themselves, who's going to give them those missiles? Germany Tauruses or America Tomahawks? No, America will give Tomahawks to Putin only. And I'm serious about this, because if Trump considers, and it can be so, that the main goal of the United States is to take over Greenland, in this sense, Putin is his ally, the same type of ally that Stalin was for Hitler and Hitler was for Stalin when they needed to divide Europe. So therefore, if Trump plans to invade Greenland, take over Greenland, then of course Putin is his indispensable ally in this regard. No Tomahawks for Ukraine. It's even useless to discuss that. Yes, the weapons will be given by Europe, or should be given by Europe. And we know that since February 2022, slowly Europe is moving in the right direction. It's just moving very slowly. And the same thing what they're doing today. They could have done it in March of 2022. Then the war would have been going completely differently. And of course, it wouldn't last for 4 years. Today it's January 14th. And January 14th, this is the day when the Russo-Ukrainian war becomes longer than the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union. And I'm sure that the peace treaty won't be signed by January 14. The reason why the war is so long, of course, this is the fault of the United States and Europe. And the United States when Biden was in power, but when Biden was gone, a new time began. And of course, Europe and the United States are to be blamed for what's going on. Ukraine is fighting very well. And we can add here that Ukraine is fighting much better than everybody expected. But if Europe doesn't change the tactics of the war may become eternal. And the war can be eternal because Russia can fight this war infinitely. So far, Europe has been holding conferences as part of the coalition of the willing. The latest one took place in Paris this week, where they discussed the guarantees of security in case of a new Russian invasion. And on the internet, they were laughing. So what about the new invasion? So you haven't dealt with the old invasion yet. So, but can we say that they have this potential? So say those bases, military bases that France and Germany are supposed to build, can they begin to realize it? Not after the peace treaty, but now. I think it's not going to happen. Of course, in some perfect world, but the world is far from perfect. But say some perfect option we have. Say Europeans, they're transferring their troops to Ukraine and they're building bases there. Well, first of all, it's not going to happen. And secondly, there is no really a need for that. Because, as Chancellor Merz said during his meeting in Washington, where Trump was and the leaders of the European countries, the only guarantee of security of Ukraine is the Ukrainian army. And the point is, it's not that the Ukrainian army is the guarantee of security of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army is the guarantee of security of the whole Europe, because Europe doesn't have an army. They have a potential to build a big army, because the European Union is a very powerful entity. And here we can include Japan, Australia, and Canada. But say an army with a 4-year experience fighting a war, of course they don't have it. Ukraine is the only country that does. And all the drafts of peace treaties, Trump's, Putin, and there is this, they have this point of demobilization of the Ukrainian army. And of course, while Ukraine has the army, Russia can't invade Europe any further. Russia has no chance to move forward. And Russia will have this ability as soon as the Ukrainian army is demobilized. And this is what Putin is counting on, and Trump too, that demobilization of the Ukrainian army will give a chance to Putin to go further. And in fact, there is no peace treaty or peace plan that includes demobilization of the Russian army. So the Russian army can't invade Europe while the Ukrainian army is fighting. So, but it's not going to happen because Ukraine is not going to surrender, Europe is not going to surrender. There are two scenarios. Either the war will go on like this more and more and more, or the Europeans and the leadership of Ukraine, they'll change the tactics of the war, they'll carry out strikes on Moscow. Don't expect anything from Putin, because there won't be any Putin. And then after that, maybe somebody, not Putin, will get at the negotiation table with Ukraine. What kind of negotiations will be, it's a different matter. But the guarantees of security of Ukraine and Europe, this is Ukrainian army only. There can't be any other guarantees. And nobody will give these guarantees to Ukraine. Because you can't trust Putin. New leaders of Russia won't be trusted either, I think. So we'll see what kind of leaders there will be. If they're like old leaders from old FSB, if it's kind of the same thing, I'm sure they won't be any better than Putin if they come in power. So it's not worth thinking that we'll have an easy solution here. Though it can be pretty quick if the tactics of the war is changed. Let's see. So Greenland. No matter what the decision will be about Greenland, if it's going to be a mid-term or long-term decision, is Greenland a factor or some sort of test? And based on this test, Putin can make certain conclusions, whether he can hypothetically invade the Baltic countries. You know, I think what's important here is not whether Trump is going to make an attempt to take over Greenland. And by the way, it's actually quite possible. I can't really imagine this, of course. But there is an American military base in Greenland. And this base has weapons, and Americans can transfer as many troops as they need to take over Greenland, and they can do it within 24 hours, as Crimea was taken over by Russia. The consequences of this takeover, it's hard to imagine, but it's not the most amazing thing. You can actually conquer any countries today. In Putin's case, we understand that changes will happen only if the regime is changed at a new historical phase, at a new split of Russia. All these territories will be returned to Ukraine. But in Greenland's case, we are not to wait for the end of the regime, but we need to wait for the end of Trump's term. In Greenland's case, this is an operation for 3 years. Let's say Trump leaves. Obviously, theoretically, there are some other options, but they're merely theoretical. But it's clear that in 3 years, Greenland will be returned to the Kingdom of Denmark. It's important to see what's happening within the United States and without the United States. And everything that's happening there actually has a term. Say the 3 years that Trump has left in power. Therefore, we can look at it with a bit of a smile from sort of aside. I mean, at what's going on with Greenland. I hope that the Americans won't begin to kill people, literally. But in 3 years, the rest of it will be just over. And again, let's see what Trump is going to come up with and what risks he is ready to take. But the fact is that it will lead to a breakup between Europe and the United States. I don't know if it's going to be any breakup of their diplomatic relationship, but it will be a real breakup between Europe and the United States. And Putin is eager to see that. And the ice of Greenland doesn't concern him much. But both of them, they're crazy in their way. Both Trump and Putin. Russia is taking over the Arctic because they think that the ice will melt tomorrow and they will discover enormous mineral resources. And I'm sure they are there when the ice melts. But right now the FSB is setting up border posts in the Arctic to claim that this is theirs when it comes to dividing the Arctic. Trump has a similar approach to Greenland. So they calculated in Trump's administration that when the ice melts, so they'll have it. Trump is leaving all the environmental treaties, but he sort of follows the rumors that the ice is still melting, and when it melts, so you gotta be ready to take it over. And together with Witkoff, they will be able to divide everything, and 50% of that wealth will belong to Trump. Corruption during Trump is through the roof. You can't even call it corruption anymore. It's something beyond corruption. We need to come up with a new word for that. Is it Trump who is going to devise what to do with Greenland? Or it's Miller or Rubio? No, both Rubio and Miller. Miller is more, Rubio less. They actually don't have a voting right. In fact, in Trump's administration, nobody has a voting right but Trump. And this is very important to understand. There are people whom Trump trusts. This is Kushner and Witkoff. They do this shuttle diplomacy. And actually without leaving any traces. And it's very interesting because meetings of Witkoff and Putin actually happen one-on-one. I'm sure that on the Russian side there are some people, but on the American side there is no one. And this is the condition under which Putin and Witkoff have their meetings. This is the condition of the meeting, that nobody from the American side can be allowed to these meetings. And this is absolutely unheard of for the United States. To say it's unacceptable, it's just to say nothing. It just never happened like this. And this attempt of Trump to meet with Putin one-on-one, we actually saw it during his first term. Therefore, what Putin and Witkoff talk about, and then what Witkoff tells Trump after that, only Trump and Putin know. The same has to do with Kushner. Neither Kushner nor Witkoff were elected. They're not government officials. They're Trump's representatives for negotiations, for very important and very secret negotiations. And from what we know, the topics for these negotiations are about money and dividing wealth of different countries like Ukraine, Venezuela, maybe Greenland. And there is a serious problem on that. Therefore, Rubio may take part in some political negotiations, but Rubio knows very well if he deviates from the options that Trump offers him, he will be fired next day. And all other officials of Trump's administration know that too. So in this sense, none of them has a voting right. And I expect, and this won't be any loss for anybody, I expect that at some point Rubio will leave on his own, or perhaps he will be fired from his position. And it's not that because his conscience all of a sudden wakes up. I don't think it's really so. I think that sooner or later he will realize that he can't cross this line anymore. So we're not going to say anything about red lines. Maybe Rubio also has some red lines, but so far he is trying to adjust to Trump as much as he can, and he's not doing it really well, and you can see that he doesn't enjoy that, and he does it without any enthusiasm, while the others do it with great enthusiasm, and they actually enjoy it. By the way, Marco Rubio, do you think he is a favorite within the Republican Party to run for president? Because they keep saying Vance, but now it looks like Vance is in the background. I think, according to certain rules of the game, it is Vance, and if it's not Vance, then I expect that somebody from Trump's sons will take part in the race. And I don't think that Rubio has any chances, because just by the fact that he was in Trump's administration, he compromised himself. If he runs for president as Trump's supporter, then the Republicans who support Trump, they most probably prefer a different supporter of Trump. For example, Vance. According to recent polls, though the results of those polls are not quite ready yet, they're a bit raw, but nevertheless they can tell that the favorite is Vance. At the same time, 11% of the polled, and the polls were run among Republicans. So 11% of the Republicans, they wouldn't mind if Trump stays for the third term, though these 11%, they know very well that this would be a violation of American laws. But right now, nobody really knows if there are any laws in America, and can these laws be violated. Because Trump actually violated many laws. What people used to consider a law, Trump managed to overpower it, and he can explain that this is not a law and it can be violated. So the same attitude is to the third term. So we'll see what will happen. Will Trump stay for the third term or not? I think he will try to do that, and what will be next we'll see. Meanwhile, in the United States, in Minneapolis, there is a civil uprising after one of the officers of ICE. How do they call it properly? Is it like immigration police or something like that? Yes, this is a new tool. It has been around, but it has never been used as Trump is using it now. And Trump uses it in such a way that they sent about 2,000 professionally trained, armed, not even policemen, say people. It's like a special forces. In fact, this is a special force, special service, and they're armed from head to foot. 2,000 people, and they do certain activities there, fighting illegal immigration. But again, just like with Maduro case, in principle, absolutely everybody, almost everybody, agrees that illegal immigration should be dealt with, and the illegal immigration is bad. But the methods of dealing with it that Trump uses, they're so wild and so cruel. And at the same time, no one knows whether they actually bring positive results. Therefore, some people are simply disappointed with this, but in the worst case scenario, we have public uprising, because there is a lot of illegal immigration in America, and you shouldn't think that these are the people who just yesterday crossed the border of the United States and now they're doing nothing in the US, they're just idling. But it's not like that. Oftentimes, these are people who've been living in the United States for many, many years and they actually pay taxes. Some of them don't. They work the jobs that Americans don't want to. And clearly, not all the jobs Americans actually desire. But these immigrants, they've been living in the States for several generations. They have wives, children, and they don't do any harm to anybody. On the contrary, they do a lot of good. Though according to their status, they're illegal immigrants anyway. Besides, we see that Trump is raising the issue of changing the status for the people who already have the status, including those people who have citizenship, who already have gotten the citizenship, let alone the people who have permanent residence in the United States without a citizenship. So this is the problem. Trump changes the rules of the game, meaning that he abolishes laws, because they can easily cancel a political refugee status or status of permanent residency or citizenship. And sometimes they can even do that for a substantiated reason. Say, they lied to the immigration service when they were filling out the application form. But this is quite a broad excuse for the immigration service. And it can be applied to many people who live in the United States and are not naturalized. If the authorities go along with this, of course they can deprive many people of their citizenship or their refugee status. We already heard how Russian citizens who asked for political asylum in the United States, those Russians were sent back to Russia, and I don't know what's going to happen to them. In Stalin's time, it was clear they would be sentenced to death. Were they sent from the United States now, when Putin is in power, when there is no capital punishment? I don't know, but I don't think that anything good is awaiting these people in Russia. That's why they ran from Russia. So that's the problem with Trump. Americans As it turns out, they're deprived of their rights. It seems that they're Americans with American passports, but at the same time, they have no rights. They're absolutely helpless before the lawlessness that Trump's administration unleashes. Well, theoretically speaking, things probably are right. They need to fight corruption, they need to fight illegal immigration, and it turns out that in Minnesota there is quite a serious corruption, and maybe this corruption is everywhere, but for some reason those guys in Minnesota were caught. All these bad things should be fought against, but the way Trump does it, people are not happy with, and they have all the reasons, because this whole thing grows into the lawlessness. And yes, you say that what Trump does within the United States and without, this will last only for 3 years, just for his term. But Maduro hardly comes back to Venezuela in 3 years. So I'm moving to Putin now. So what we see, Putin lost Assad is his ally, his military base in Syria. Putin now doesn't have Maduro anymore. We don't know what's going to happen within Venezuela. But Putin lost his ally. Maybe in the near future, Putin will lose Khamenei in Iran. So, what do you think? How strategically bad it is for Putin? Well, Putin started losing strategically when he started the war in Ukraine, because from the point of view of a foreign policy of the Russian Federation, if we kind of abstract ourselves from Putin and FSB, and let's think that Russia as a state has strategic interests, foreign policy goals, no one has damaged Russia more than Putin. Nobody. Maybe Hitler, when he invaded Russia and started the war, killed people, devastated towns and cities. But again, it's a question who actually killed more, Stalin or Hitler, but we know the answer. Stalin killed more, and who was destroying more cities and villages. So if during collectivization and the famine, Stalin destroyed more villages and towns. But Hitler was pure evil that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. So the next one, in terms of the level of damages, this is Putin. Nobody actually understands that well and sees that. But there are obvious examples. Russia has never been isolated more than during Putin's time. Even during Stalin, the isolation wasn't so extreme. Neutral Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and only Putin could manage to achieve that. Let alone that Ukraine, that used to be a big, good neighbor of the Russian Federation, now for many decades will be an enemy of Russia, and the Ukrainians will never ever forgive Russia for this war. It is very important to understand the meaning of this word, never. Ukraine will never forgive Russia for this war. Never. Putin will leave at some point. Maybe certain things change in Russia at some point. But Ukraine will never forgive Russia for this war. Unfortunately, Putin doesn't see it. Nobody is disturbed by that in Russia. All these people, they live in Russia without thinking, without understanding that they're committing something that they won't be forgiven ever for. In fact, it's a horrible punishment. The Germans have been living with this for decades, and only now, little by little, against the backdrop of Russian invasion of Ukraine, it started changing, because all people who participated in World War II, they passed away. Maybe now the situation changed for Germany. But even though, the Jews will always remember that, they will be remembering that, they will always remember the role of Germany in World War II. That's a horrible burden for the state, and this is what Putin pulled Russia into. And we don't know why. What was the reason? Because Russia got no benefits from this. After 4 years of the war, Russia didn't manage to conquer Ukraine. Russia didn't improve its status in Europe. So really, no advantages. It's an absolutely failing policy. And this is Putin's policy. Will there be time when people in Russia begin to understand what happened? And will there be people who will want to change the regime? Many people today want to change the regime today, but clearly it can be changed only with weapons in your hands. But only FSB, Russian Guard, and the Russian army have the weapons, and Ukrainian army. So we'll see how things will unfold. But sadly, Putin damaged Russia irreversibly, and many people in the Russian immigration, they don't really like that. But for some decades, we must forget about Russia as a civilized state, because Russia won't become a civilized state in the next 10 years. Free Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, they have weapons, but they're structural divisions of Ukrainian intelligence agency. So those of our viewers who'd like to support these divisions, you can use the QR code and you can support these troops. You can do it on a monthly basis, or you can do a one-off donation. And a few more announcements I will do in the end. Our viewers may become sponsors of Free Russia Forum channel. In the chat, you can find the dollar icon, and you can sponsor the channel. Free Russia Forum will take place in February. This could be offline conference. On our channel and our website, you can learn more about the program of the forum. You can register for this forum. And the last thing I'd like to say, many questions come from our viewers and readers. What Garry Kasparov thinks about the situation with Leonid Volkov, the head of Navalny's foundation. We spoke spoke to many people about it. On Sunday, there will be interview with Gary Kasparov. He'll answer your questions and he'll tell you what he thinks about this. So follow the announcements, and thank you, Yuri, very much for this great conversation. Thank you, thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.